Okay. So we've had a few video requests to do a half a hog with just a hand saw. So if you're doing a half a hog at your house, then this is how you're gonna be doing it. So I'm gonna do two different versions. The first one will be bone-in chops. The second one will be boneless chops. And we'll go from there. So first cut is gonna be 1, 2, 3, 4 ribs in. And then you wanna make sure the saw is right in this dip, so not on that seam. And then just cut square to keep the pork shoulder square and your chops, so the loin square. Second one is gonna be, if you see this line come up, right at that vertebrae, right where it turns, that first piece, that's where your next cut is gonna be. We'll cut straight off right there. So that separates out the leg, the middle, and the shoulder. So we'll do the shoulder piece first. So this will separate the pork butt from the picnic cushion. This first cut you're gonna do just right where this comes down, usually about a hand or a finger width away from that spine. And I'm gonna cut and let the saw do the work. I'm gonna cut until I hit that next bone. And then once it gets through that, then I'll finish it out with my knife. Make sure everything stays nice and straight. So that separates the pork butt piece from the cushion. So I'm gonna take these 4 ribs off that I counted out. And those will go into trim. Next is this jowl piece. I'm gonna pull it off to right the front of that shoulder, squares around the end. So you can save this jowl piece if you wanna do jowl bacon. If you wanna do any charcuterie, there's recipes that have jowl in there. Otherwise you can lean it up. It's really good for a fat add to your trim. So if you're doing summer sausage or brats, the jowl is gonna be a little bit sweeter. I'm gonna cut out some of these glands that are up here in the front and just get it all ready. So there's the jowl piece. So this next piece is the picnic cushion. So you can do, if you wanna do a bone-in roast, then, so maybe I'll do a bone-in roast on this one. So I'm gonna cut a line to score it, and then I'll use my hand saw again, just to get through that bone. Once it's through the bone, then I'll finish it out with my knife. So this is a nice little shoulder piece. And then on the second one, right under this elbow, you can cut your shank off, but you'll have this dip up here. So I'm just gonna mark it, and then I'll use the saw again. So I'm cutting this pretty much the same way that I would cut with the bandsaw, but I'm just using the hand saw. So that still gives you a nice little shank piece. So if you're gonna do a full bone-in butt, you'll take this vertebrae piece out right here and then square it up, and then that's where your pork butt comes from. But since we're cutting these as bone-in, I'm gonna cut through here, again as if I was using the bandsaw. I'm just gonna cut until I get through that bone. These will be some nice bone-in roasts. I can trim this fat down a little bit. So there's a little shoulder roast. And then I'm gonna do one more bone-in out of here. So I'm gonna leave that vertebrae in cutting through this first one so that it gives me a little bit of structure. Because one of the hard things if you've got a handsaw is if your pieces are flopping all over the place, it's hard to get it to cut straight through. So that's why I didn't bone that piece out, because I want a little bit of structure on the top end, which will keep everything straight. So that way when I cut this, you can see it's straight and it's not all bouncing around. And then after it's cut, now I'll trim this piece out, and then I can trim the fat. Because again, nice little shoulder roast. Now I'll bone the rest of this piece out. And then I'm gonna square this up. So that line I usually cut right where this rounds out. So I'll cut that to square it, which keeps this nice roast. I'll trim some fat off there. So there's all my shoulder roasts. Saving that fat, it's garbage. So that is good for sausage. Okay, next, come on the sirloin. So if you do a boneless sirloin, you can just cut it off straight here and then bone it out. We're gonna be doing bone-in sirloins. So again, I'm actually gonna trim this back so that I can see where I'm going. This is just trim off that sirloin piece, or off the front of that belly. So my first cut is gonna be right here where this dips. As soon as I get through the bone, I'll stop, finish it out with my knife so I can keep everything nice and square. A little bit of trimming to get these glands out. So these hogs that we're doing, these are Bingham's farm hogs. So we raise these at our house. We've got these available all the time, just through our website to order. So there's that first, and then the next one I'm gonna go right where the H-bone is. So that first one I took off, here's the next one. I'll cut right through here. As soon as I fill it through the bone, I'll get my knife, finish that cut, keep it nice and square, right there. And I'll trim this down. So there's a nice little sirloin roast there. And then this leaves you the whole ham that you can go through and cure. Okay, next is the middle. So I'm gonna cut out this skirt steak piece for trim. And then I'm gonna have bone-in chops on this middle. And then we'll do another video that's boneless chops. So right here where this eye is, I'll make a little bit of a mark. And then I'm gonna look on this end where that comes through, that belly comes through. I'll score it with my knife. Where there's no ribs right here, I'm gonna separate that all the way down to the table. And then I'm gonna keep my saw pretty flat because I only wanna cut through the ribs and I wanna keep them nice and square so that my bacon, which is this part, is gonna stay nice and square. So as soon as I get through those ribs, I'll finish squaring it off with my knife. There's the belly separated. Now this is gonna be bone-in chops. So before I cut through, I'm gonna cut some of my fat down. You can leave the fat on. We do a 1/4-inch fat trim here just to keep everything consistent. This fat is really nice. Again, these are from our farm, Bingham's farm. Okay, so once you have that through, now you can see right between all these vertebrae is where we're going to be cutting our chops. So the first one's going to be right here. I'm going to cut just enough right there to get through the vertebrae. If you don't want your chops this thick, you can cut one between. But if you cut through these vertebrae like this, then it'll follow the rib through. And I'm just cutting until I get through that bone. So on this, so I'm keeping these square as if they were on the bandsaw. You can see that the ribs turn a little, which I'm still cutting through some of those ribs. Another option would be is if you squared that off, then you could angle your cuts. So that way all of your chops coming down will just have one rib in it. But we're doing this whole hog as if it were on a bandsaw. And this is how we would do it on the bandsaw to keep that loin square. So now it's squared out. Now that we're getting a little bit toward the end, we're just gonna be able to do this. So you can open this up with your knife, so that way your saw has a place to go. Okay, so now that those are all cut, now I can come through and finish cutting my chops. To keep everything nice and clean, I only cut through the bone with the handsaw, and I can finish cutting everything else out with the knife. Here, I'm going to move to the table right here. Finish cutting these. So there's some nice thick. Those are pretty thick. Again, if you wanted to cut between those with the handsaw, you can do that to adjust. Right where there's a dip on the vertebrae, that makes a good spot to start that next cut. And then you can end up with either 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch chops. So most of these are about an inch, inch and a half, but that gives a good layout on the chops. Start back here. Okay, and then the last piece is going to be this belly. So this is where our bacon comes from, and the spare back ribs. So you need to cut just right under. And there's a seam that you'll look for. Right here you can see where it comes through, so you can even cut really shallow so you don't cut into your bacon, and cut through to this seam, which is where these ribs are going to come off. And then just right under the sternum piece right here. So from the underside of the ribs, now you can just connect your lines. And there's the spare back ribs, and we do St. Louis style, which we'll cut right where this sternum piece is. Cut that sternum out, and there's the St. Louis style spare backs. And then I'm just gonna shape this pork belly so we can get it into brine for our bacon. So that is a half a hog with just a handsaw and a boning knife.